Sienna had never felt more beautiful or more certain. Her black silk dress hugged her gently. Her silver necklace shimmered like a promise, and across the candle-lit table, her husband Graham raised a glass of champagne with a soft smile that, for one fleeting second, made her believe everything was perfect. They were celebrating 10 years of marriage, a decade of trying, crying, and silently praying for the child they never had. She had spent weeks planning this night, imagining maybe he'd surprise her with a weekend getaway, or simply whisper that he still believed in their future together, even if that future didn't include children. Instead, as the waiter brought out the dessert, raspberry torte shaped like a heart, Graham cleared his throat and placed a folded napkin over his plate, as though shielding it from what he was about to say. "Sienna," he began, and already her stomach knotted. "I think it's time we stop pretending." The restaurant buzzed around them, laughter and soft jazz filling the air, but her world went quiet. "I've met someone," he continued, looking down at his untouched wine. "She's younger, and she's pregnant." The knife in her chest wasn't his words. It was the way he said them, without shame or hesitation, as if he were announcing a business merger. "You're a good woman, Sienna," he added, "but I want a family, and I've waited long enough." She blinked, the clink of glass in the distance echoing like gunfire. "You're doing this here?" she whispered, her voice dry, trembling. "On our anniversary?" He nodded, as though it were a kindness. "I thought this would soften it." The torte sat between them, its perfect heart shape mocking her. Around them, diners glanced up, sensing a quiet storm. Sienna stood slowly, her napkin falling to the floor like a white flag. Her chair scraped the wood, too loud, too final. "Don't make a scene," he murmured, still seated. She looked at him for a long moment, memorizing the curve of betrayal on his lips, then turned and walked out into the cold evening without her coat, her heels clicking like defiance against the cobblestone. Outside, the wind stung her bare arms, but she didn't flinch. Her womb may have been empty, but tonight she realized something far worse. Her marriage had been, too. And while Graham returned to his meal, Sienna vanished into the night, unaware that within 24 hours, a stranger in a white coat would hand her a truth more powerful than any betrayal. The clinic smelled like lemon antiseptic and tired hope. Sienna sat quietly in the waiting room the next morning, fingers clutching a manila envelope with her latest test results. Just another folder of disappointment, she thought. Her eyes were red from the night before, but she wore sunglasses anyway, more for armor than for light. She hadn't slept. Instead, she'd paced the apartment for hours, touching old baby clothes she'd once bought in secret, staring at framed photos that meant nothing now. The receptionist called her name, and she followed down a sterile hallway where everything was too clean, too white, too fake. Then the door opened, and in stepped Dr. Elias Moore, young, calm-eyed, with a softness that made Sienna blink twice. "Mrs. Mathers?" he asked gently. She nodded. He didn't look at the folder first. He looked at her. Really looked. "You doing okay?" he asked, not as a physician, but as a man who already knew she wasn't. She hesitated, then laughed bitterly. "You don't have enough time for that answer." He offered a small smile. "I've got 10 minutes, and no one after you. Try me." Sienna's hands trembled as she placed the envelope on the desk. "These should tell you everything." He didn't reach for it right away. Instead, he poured her a cup of water from a jug in the corner, placed it in front of her, and waited. For a moment, the silence felt like breathing room. Then he opened the folder, scanning the pages. His brow lifted, then furrowed. "Has anyone walked you through this properly?" She shook her head. "They usually just say the same thing," Unexplained infertility? Maybe hormone shots? Maybe nothing. He tapped a paragraph with his pen. This isn't unexplained. This is a misdiagnosis. And if I'm reading this right, there's a very good chance you were never infertile at all. Your prior doctor missed a polyp that's now resolved itself. Your hormone levels are not just good. They're ideal. Sienna stared at him like he'd spoken in tongues. What? He nodded slowly. There's nothing stopping you from carrying a child, Sienna. Not anymore. Her lips parted, but no words came. Then, all at once, she began to cry. Not the quiet, polite tears of a woman trying to stay composed, but the guttural sob of someone who had been carrying a lie too long. Elias didn't speak. He simply handed her tissues and waited. When she could finally breathe again, she looked up and whispered, "Why didn't anyone see this before?" He shook his head. Because they weren't really looking at you. And in that room, with cold walls and warm eyes, something inside Sienna shifted. The man who left her last night never saw her. But maybe someone finally had. A week later, Sienna returned to Dr. Elias Moore's clinic, but this time, her footsteps were slower, steadier, no longer weighed down by disbelief. She had spent days replaying his words in her mind, afraid to believe them, afraid to hope again. But something about the way he looked at her, like she wasn't broken, had stitched something back together. He'd called her personally and scheduled a sonogram, just to be sure. Now, as she lay on the examination table with cold gel spread across her lower belly and the hum of the machine filling the silence, she felt her heart thunder in her chest like a runaway horse. Elias held the wand gently, guiding it over her skin with practiced hands, eyes focused on the monitor, his expression unreadable. Sienna kept her eyes locked on his face, searching for any clue. The seconds stretched unbearably, until finally, Elias smiled, soft and stunned. "There," he whispered, tilting the monitor toward her. Sienna looked, breath caught. A flicker. A heartbeat. A miracle. "You're 7 weeks along," he said, voice barely above a whisper. "You're pregnant." The words shattered her reality. Pregnant. She gasped, one hand flying to her mouth, the other trembling as she reached for the screen, as if she could touch the tiny flicker of life glowing inside her. "But how?" she choked out. Elias shook his head, awed. "Sometimes the body finds its own way. Maybe it was the polyp clearing. Maybe it was timing. Maybe it was you never being infertile to begin with." He turned the volume up slightly, and suddenly, the rhythmic thump, thump, thump of the baby's heart filled the room like music. Sienna cried again, but this time it was different. No grief, no shame. It was the sound of years of waiting breaking open into joy. "I don't even know who I am anymore," she said between gasps. "Everything's changed." Elias smiled gently, handing her a printout of the image. "Maybe you're finally who you were meant to be." Sienna stared at the tiny form on the photo, already feeling fiercely protective of it. "I thought I lost everything that night," she whispered. "But I didn't. I was just being cleared out for something bigger." As she walked out of the clinic, the sky seemed brighter, the air lighter. The woman her husband had left at that anniversary dinner was gone. In her place walked someone new, someone not just carrying life, but becoming it. And the man who had first seen her was still watching from the doorway, quietly, with something unspoken in his eyes. By the time her first trimester neared its end, Sienna had moved back into the little apartment above the bookstore she once adored as a college student. Dusty wood floors, creaky steps, and all. She hadn't told anyone except her sister about the baby, not even her old friends or co-workers. The town was too small, the gossip too quick, and Sienna too tired to explain. But secrets have a way of leaking, especially when tied to a woman like her, formerly married to a real estate agent whose affairs were whispered long before they were confirmed. That morning, she only wanted bread, milk, and ginger tea to ease her nausea. But as she stood in line at the local grocery store, basket in hand and hoodie drawn low, she heard it, one name, then another. "Sienna Caldwell," said a woman behind her, not even bothering to lower her voice. "You heard? She's pregnant, after all that talk of infertility, after he left her?" Another snorted. "Bet it's not even his. You know how women get once they're alone. Desperate." Sienna's spine straightened. She didn't turn. She just counted her breaths and stared at the conveyor belt. Poor thing. And at her age? What's she gonna do with a baby now? Came the final sting. The cashier gave her a soft, pitying look. Sienna smiled back faintly, nodded, and paid. But when she stepped out into the sunlight, the paper bag warm in her arms and her stomach slightly aching from stress, something shifted inside her. Not rage, not even hurt, just a gentle defiance. She'd survived worse. A year ago, she would have run home and wept. Today, she walked slowly, proudly, one hand resting on her barely visible bump, the other clutching her groceries like armor. She wasn't ashamed. She was building something. That evening, Dr. Elias stopped by, a brown bag of soup and prenatal vitamins in hand. "Saw your lights on," he said simply. She let him in without a word. Over dinner, she finally asked, "Why are you doing this?" He stirred his spoon slowly. "Because someone should have done it for my sister. She was in your shoes once. No one believed in her." Sienna stared at him, a silence deep and meaningful stretching between them. And in that quiet moment, something like trust began to bloom. Not romantic, not yet, but something stronger, something that would carry both of them forward. Sienna hadn't planned to attend the community dinner, but her sister Ava insisted. "You can't hide forever," Ava had said, slipping a soft blue dress into her hands. "You look beautiful in this. Let them see that." Reluctantly, Sienna went. The dinner was held in the town's refurbished old barn, now strung with fairy lights and polished floors, filled with the sounds of music, clinking silverware, and conversations about nothing and everything. As she stepped in, heads turned. She felt it immediately, the pause, the murmurs, the eyes dipping to her stomach before darting away. She held her chin up, let her shoulders square themselves, and kept walking. Ava gripped her hand once in support, and then vanished into the crowd. Sienna found a quiet corner near the refreshment table and settled in. The smell of rosemary chicken made her stomach turn, but she sipped lemonade to keep calm. She didn't expect Dr. Elias to arrive late or to scan the room before walking directly toward her. "May I sit?" he asked. "Please," she said, grateful for an anchor. They didn't say much at first, but as the dinner progressed, people started to drift by. Some nodded politely. Others offered awkward smiles. But it was when Monica, her ex-husband's cousin, arrived with her perfectly dressed children and carefully manicured grin that the real moment arrived. "Sienna, I was so sorry to hear," Monica said, her voice syrupy with pretend concern. "It's just, well, I heard about the baby. I suppose miracles happen even for those who weren't meant to be mothers, huh?" The implication hung in the air like poison. Sienna could have stayed quiet. She could have smiled and let it go. But she didn't. She took a breath, then stood. "You're right, Monica," she said, her voice steady. "It is a miracle. Not because I wasn't meant to be a mother, but because I became one in my own time, on my own terms. And that's more than most people get." Monica blinked, stunned. Dr. Elias stood beside her without a word, but his quiet presence made Sienna feel 10 feet tall. Someone nearby clapped, then another. It wasn't loud, but it was enough. Enough for Sienna to know the tide was changing, enough for her to breathe again. That night, as she sat alone in her apartment, hands on her belly, she whispered, "You're already giving me courage I never knew I had." Outside, the wind moved gently against the window, and for the first time in months, Sienna didn't feel alone. The morning after the dinner, Sienna awoke to a soft knock at the door. So soft she thought it might have been her imagination. She wrapped herself in her robe, tiptoed barefoot across the apartment floor, and cracked the door open. There was no one there. Only an envelope, placed neatly on her doormat, sealed with a red wax circle pressed with a strange symbol she didn't recognize. Her breath caught. She looked down the hallway, empty, then picked it up and shut the door behind her. Her hands trembled as she opened it. Inside was a short note, handwritten in clean script. "You spoke with courage last night. Come by the clinic at 2 p.m. No obligation. E." Sienna's fingers traced the letter. It wasn't romantic. It wasn't overly kind. It was just human, director, respectful. She sat on her sofa and stared at it for 10 minutes before the kettle even boiled. For hours, she paced, fighting herself over what it meant, if it meant anything at all. But at exactly 1:55 p.m., she stood in front of Elias's clinic door, her heart racing like it hadn't in months. The receptionist didn't even ask her name. "Go right in," she said with a quiet smile. Elias stood beside a small ultrasound machine, sleeves rolled to his elbows, eyes gentle but unreadable. "You came," he said. "I did," she replied, then hesitated. "Why?" He gestured to the table. "You said this baby was a miracle. I believe you. I wanted to show you something." She lay down, breath shallow. The gel was cold, but the moment the monitor lit up, all else faded. The soft, rhythmic thump, thump, thump of her baby's heartbeat echoed in the room. Her eyes filled. "Strong," he said. "Perfect, actually." She looked at him, searching his face for anything beyond professional distance. "Do you think I'll be enough?" she whispered. Elias didn't answer right away. Then he pulled something from the drawer, a tiny crocheted yellow cap. "I don't know everything," he said, "but I think the fact that you're even asking that question already makes you more than enough." She held the cap, speechless. As she left, a small girl in the waiting room looked up and said, "Are you the lady with the baby?" Sienna smiled softly. Yes, I am." And for the first time, that answer felt like a crown instead of a burden. When she stepped outside into the sunlight, the wind caught her hair just so, and in that sliver of a second, she swore the world looked different. More possible, somehow. Elias invited her to dinner the following Saturday. Not as a patient, not under the dim glow of hospital lights, but in the quiet of his small craftsman house, tucked just beyond the edge of town. Sienna hesitated before saying yes, unsure of what it meant or what she was walking into. But something inside her whispered it was time to stop walking away. When she arrived, she wore the soft green cardigan her mother had once knit, and Elias, standing in the doorway with flour dusting his sleeves and a dish towel tossed over one shoulder, looked less like a doctor and more like a man she'd once imagined in another lifetime. "You're early," he smiled. "I didn't want to think too long and change my mind," she replied, brushing hair behind her ear. Inside, the house was warm, filled with the scent of fresh herbs and something baking. The dining table was set simply but beautifully. Candles, mismatched plates, and in the center, a small yellow flower in a chipped glass jar. It's not fancy, Elias said, but it's real. They ate homemade pasta and laughed more than they expected, talked about books and favorite childhood meals. And then, after a long pause, Sienna finally said, "He never wanted to cook with me. Said the kitchen was my space and he had better things to do." Elias didn't respond immediately. He poured her another glass of water, then quietly asked, "Did you ever feel seen by him?" She looked down. "Only when I was crying, and even then it wasn't comfort. It was annoyance." Elias nodded slowly, then stood and brought out dessert, 2 slices of lemon pie and a tiny third one on a toy plate. "For the guest of honor," he grinned. Sienna laughed, a soft, real, surprised sound. She touched the toy plate gently. "She's not even here yet." "She's still part of everything," he said. They didn't kiss. They didn't even touch. But as he walked her to her car, he said softly, "You don't have to do this alone anymore." She paused, hand on the door, eyes lifted toward him. "I'm still figuring out how to trust that." "Take your time," he said. "I'm not going anywhere." As she drove home, her fingers rested lightly on the steering wheel, but her heart felt full, like she'd eaten more than just food, like something had finally begun to heal without anyone forcing it. And that, somehow, was enough for now. The knock on her door that Monday came with the kind of chill no weather could explain. Sienna opened it slowly, and there, standing with the same smug smirk he'd worn the day he walked out, was Landon, her ex-husband. His tailored coat, expensive cologne, and perfectly styled hair didn't match the man who had once claimed she'd dragged his life down. He didn't say hello. He just walked in. "I heard you're pregnant," he said flatly, scanning the apartment like it offended him. Sienna closed the door behind him, but didn't invite him to sit. "You're not welcome here," she said evenly. Landon shrugged. "I have a right to know if it's mine." Her breath caught, rage rising, but she forced it down. "You left me at an anniversary dinner with a note that said you were done trying to love someone broken. That note ended your rights." His mouth twitched, but he recovered quickly. "You could be after support. Maybe that's why you're cozying up to that doctor." Her hand balled into a fist at her side. "I don't need a dime from you, Landon. And this child, this miracle, has nothing to do with you." He laughed coldly. "You're telling me you just magically got pregnant after years of infertility? Sounds convenient?" She walked to a drawer, pulled out a folder, and threw it on the table. Inside, test results, fertility timelines, proof of her condition improving, and most importantly, records of conception long after Landon had left. "This isn't for you. This is for me, to remind myself that miracles happen when we get rid of the people blocking them." He flipped through it silently, face tightening with each page. "You look different," he finally muttered. "You seem stronger." "That's what happens when someone stops being unloved and starts loving themselves," he scoffed, standing. "You'll regret pushing me away." "I already did," she said. "For years. And now I don't anymore." As the door clicked shut behind him, her knees trembled, but she stayed standing. Moments later, her phone buzzed. It was Elias. "Just thinking of you. Everything okay?" She stared at the message, then replied, "Yes. For once, I think everything will be." She placed her hand on her belly, whispering, "He doesn't get to write our story anymore. We do." And in the silence that followed, she felt a small flutter from within, a tiny kick, like a yes echoing from her daughter. Sienna sat on the examination table, the soft rustling of paper under her legs a quiet contrast to the thundering in her heart. The monitor beside her blinked gently, and Elias stood at her side, one hand resting protectively over hers. "You ready?" he asked, his voice calm, but his thumb trembled slightly against her palm. She nodded. Breath held. The technician smiled kindly and pressed the gel to her belly, and a moment later, the room filled with the rhythmic whoosh of a tiny heartbeat. "Strong," the technician murmured. "Your baby's doing beautifully." Sienna's eyes flooded, but she blinked fast, focusing instead on the screen where the outline of a small hand waved like a secret hello. Elias watched silently, then suddenly cleared his throat and stepped back. "I'll give you a moment," he said, but Sienna reached for him. "Please stay." He returned, and this time she placed his hand on her belly, letting him feel the warmth, the truth of what they were creating. Not just a child, but a future far removed from shame. "I was told for years I couldn't be a mother," she whispered, "and I believed it. I thought I was broken. And then—" She looked up at him, her eyes raw but steady. "Then someone treated me like I wasn't." Elias's gaze didn't flinch. "You were never broken, Sienna. Just waiting to bloom in the right season." After the appointment, they walked slowly down the hospital corridor, past new fathers handing out cigars and exhausted mothers cradling fresh life. And for the first time, she didn't feel like an outsider. Outside, a spring wind tousled her hair, and she turned to Elias. "Why did you help me that day, when I was just a crying woman with a ruined dress and a broken heart?" He smiled, the kind that held pain and peace in equal measure. "Because I saw someone who was still standing, even when everything around her said she shouldn't be." That night, back in her apartment, she took out the last thing Landon had ever given her, a necklace he bought during one of their fake happy vacations. She held it in her hand, then walked it over to the trash and let it fall. Closure didn't need ceremony. Just truth. Elias brought over dinner. No grand gestures, just homemade pasta and mismatched plates. But when they sat to eat, and he placed his hand over her growing belly again, she realized something profound. This wasn't about replacing what she had lost. It was about understanding that what she had now was real. Love wasn't always dramatic. Sometimes it was a quiet man who stayed when he didn't have to, and a heartbeat that whispered, "You're not alone anymore." Sienna stood in the kitchen, apron dusted with flour, hands moving almost without thought as she rolled dough for a pie she'd never intended to bake. Outside the window, golden light spilled over the small porch where Elias sat, sanding down an old crib he'd rescued from a yard sale. The soft creak of wood and chirping birds formed the background to a morning that felt real. Not borrowed, not temporary. Just hers. The apartment was still small, still smelled like old paint and lavender oil, but now there were little signs of new life. Tiny socks folded on the couch arm, a half-assembled bassinet in the corner, and the sound of laughter sometimes, low and genuine, from two people learning to love without pretending. At noon, Sienna walked into town with Elias. She wore a pale yellow dress that hugged her bump, and he carried the folder they'd received from the hospital. The ultrasound printouts inside crinkled slightly with every step. They were going to City Hall, not to sign a marriage certificate, but to register her for prenatal support. Elias stood beside her the whole time, answering questions when her voice shook and rubbing her back when she stiffened at the word emergency contact. Afterward, they passed the restaurant where her anniversary had once shattered her life. She paused, just briefly, eyes flicking to the window where she'd once sat waiting, believing she'd be loved forever. "Do you want to walk another way?" Elias asked gently, but Sienna shook her head. "Number, let's pass through. I don't need to avoid it anymore." Inside, new people filled the booths, and her reflection in the glass was no longer the woman who had been left behind. That night, Elias prepared dinner, steak and greens and a caramel dessert she used to crave during her first trimester. They ate at the small table by the window, a candle flickering between them, laughter low and easy. After the dishes were cleared, Elias stood and pulled something from his jacket pocket. It wasn't a ring, but a tiny book, handwritten. "What's this?" she asked. "A letter," he said. "A promise. That I'll never walk away. That I'll be beside you when our child is born, when they cry for the first time, and even when you're tired and angry and need space, I'll be here." She opened it slowly, her hands trembling. Inside, his words were simple. No poetry, just truths. "You saved me too, Sienna." She cried then, not because she was sad, but because she had never known love could be so quiet and so loud all at once. As the baby kicked for the first time that night, and Elias placed his hand over her belly with startled awe, Sienna leaned her head on his shoulder and whispered, "This is our real anniversary, the one I'll celebrate for the rest of my life." And somewhere inside her, beneath every scar and memory, something healed completely. Please like, share, and subscribe to support more true-hearted stories on General Common Tales. If you'd been in that restaurant and seen the look on her face, would you have spoken to her? Tell us in the comments.